Step out of the car or I'll make you. That was the threat. But the woman he was barking at wasn't just any citizen, she was his superior. A decorated leader in the very force he thought he controlled. And the second her badge came out, his career began to crumble. And so did the system that protected men like him. No more stories that hold power accountable. Hit that subscribe button and watch to the end, because this isn't just a story. It's a warning. And it starts with one wrong shove. Step out of the car. Now. Officer Kyle Easton barked, his voice slicing through the still afternoon like a blade. Across from him stood Camille Price, calm yet unwavering, dressed in plain clothes beside her unmarked patrol car. Her presence carried a quiet authority, but Kyle wasn't interested in recognizing it. I'm authorized to be here, Camille said steadily. He didn't listen. One hand rested on his holster, a silent threat. Don't argue with me. Step back or I'll make you, he growled. The tension in the air wrapped around Camille like an insult. She raised her hand, trying to de-escalate. You don't want to do this. Just let me. But Kyle moved first. Fast. Aggressive. His shove slammed her against the car. People like you don't belong here, he sneered. Camille caught her breath. People like you, the phrase burned deeper than the bruise forming on her back. She straightened, brushing off the dust. What did you just say? She asked, locking eyes with him. I said you don't belong here. Now leave before I call backup. His sneer oozed arrogance, a misplaced authority he thought couldn't be questioned. But then Camille did something that made him freeze. She slowly reached into her pocket. Kyle flinched, his hand jumping toward his weapon. But she wasn't pulling a weapon. She pulled out her badge. His eyes locked on the gold emblem, Chief of Police. The color drained from his face. He stood there stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Camille stepped forward, voice calm but cutting. Let me explain something to you. I don't answer to you. You answer to me. The silence that followed was crushing. Kyle opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The realization of what he'd just done settled like lead in his chest. And it was only the beginning. Camille Price sat in her office, the weight of the parking lot encounter still pressing on her shoulders. The footage was clear, the violation undeniable, and she had already filed for an internal investigation. She rubbed her temples as the door creaked open. Gabriel Soto, her deputy chief, stepped in with a face tight with concern. Chief, he began carefully, we've got a situation brewing. Camille looked up sharply. Kyle Easton knows what's coming, Gabriel continued. He's already talking to some of the officers in his circle, trying to rally support. Camille leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. Support? For what? He shoved his superior officer in broad daylight. There's no defending that. Victor hesitated. It's not about defense, it's about loyalty. Some of the old guard, they don't see you as one of them. They'll frame this like you're being too harsh. Too political. Camille let out a humorless laugh. Too harsh. He assaulted the chief of police without cause. If I were a man, they'd be tripping over each other to condemn him. She stood, folding her arms. This isn't about loyalty, Gabriel. It's about fear. Fear of change. Victor gave a slow nod. He knew she was right. But he also knew how deep resistance could run. The review panel meets in 3 days, he said gently. Do you want me to take the lead on this? No, Camille replied firmly. This one's mine. Kyle Easton needs to understand actions have consequences. Not just for him, but for everyone who still believes they can operate above the rules. And with that, the battle lines were quietly drawn. In the dim fluorescent light of the locker room, Kyle Easton paced like a storm caged in too small a space. His footsteps echoed off tile and steel, restless, agitated, coiled with the kind of tension that doesn't dissolve with time, it festers. He wasn't just angry, he was afraid. Not of punishment, but of humiliation. Of being made into an example. Around him, the silence of the precinct wasn't solidarity. It was uncertainty. By the bench, Philip Kane, one of his closest allies, leaned against a row of lockers. Arms folded, gaze thoughtful but wary. You're blowing this out of proportion, Philip said. His tone meant to soothe but landing shallow. It's not like you knew she was the chief. That's not the point, Kyle snapped, spinning to face him, his eyes burning with something darker than fear. She's not just looking to reprimand me, Philip. She wants to drag me through the mud. She wants to make me the headline. Philip raised a brow. Or maybe she just wants accountability. You could apologize. Say it was a misunderstanding. That usually works. But Kyle only laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that echoed louder than any apology ever could. She wants to destroy me, he hissed. And I'm not giving her the satisfaction. Upstairs, Camille Price sat alone in her office, the soft glow of her monitor casting a pale wash across her face. She had watched the footage a dozen times already. Kyle Easton's posture, the bark of his voice, the shove. Every frame etched itself deeper into her mind. But the moment that lingered, the one she couldn't shake, wasn't the shove. It was the look in his eyes. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't even anger. It was contempt. Cold, unfiltered, and rooted in something much older than a parking lot argument. It was the look of a man who'd never had to answer to someone like her. And in that moment, Camille knew this wasn't just about protocol. It was about perception. About a culture that had allowed men like Keel to believe they were untouchable. A knock at the door pulled her back. Gabriel Soto entered again, eyes sharper than before. Chief, there's more. He's talking grievance now. Says you're targeting him. Camille didn't blink. Because of what? Victor hesitated, but the answer hung in the room before he said it. Because of race. Camille stood, slowly, deliberately. Her voice was calm, but it had the weight of thunder in a still sky. Let him. Let him spin whatever story he needs to save face. But I've got facts. I've got footage. And what I don't have, what I won't tolerate, is a culture that folds every time someone with a fragile ego cries foul. Victor nodded. He didn't need to say more, because he knew sooner or later the department would have to choose silence or spine. By the time the morning sun spilled through the high windows of the precinct, the storm had already started to gather, silent, but seething. Gabriel Soto entered the chief's office with a look that said more than words ever could. His steps were cautious, like a man crossing a frozen lake, unsure which moment might crack the ice. He's escalating, Gabriel said without preamble. Kyle Easton is threatening to file a grievance. Claims you're targeting him. He's calling it discrimination. Camille Price didn't flinch. She didn't even look up at first. Her eyes remained fixed on a report, one finger tapping steadily on the desk, a metronome of restraint. When she did speak, her voice was a slow, deliberate current beneath steel. Let him, she said. Let him dig his own grave. The truth doesn't need defense when it's written in policy and captured on camera. Victor X Soto D, but the tension didn't ease. He's got ears, Chief. He's whispering to the old guard, pulling strings where he can. The union's taken notice. They're asking questions now. Camille rose from her chair, crossed to the window, and looked out over the city, the very streets she had sworn to protect. The city that had watched her climb to the highest rank despite every barrier. Let them ask, she said. Let them all ask. The words hung in the air like a dare. Downstairs, in hushed hallways and shadowed corners, the whisper network had come alive. Old loyalties resurfaced and battle lines were quietly drawn. Some officers moved aside when Camille passed. Others stiffened, their silence not out of respect but resistance. At the union office, calls were made. Meetings scheduled. Phrases like undue pressure and bias at the top were passed around like ammunition waiting for a trigger. In the locker room, Kyle Easton held court like a man preparing for war. He wasn't looking for justice, he was looking for vengeance. To him, Camille wasn't a superior officer, she was a symbol. Of change, of challenge, of everything he believed was coming to dismantle the world he had grown comfortable in. But what he didn't understand, what none of them understood yet, was that Chief Camille Price wasn't fighting for a personal Gabriel E. She was fighting for the soul of the department. And in that war, fear wouldn't stop her. Lies wouldn't bend her. And a whisper campaign wouldn't bury her resolve. Because in a culture where power had too long been wielded without accountability, her presence alone was already revolution. The precinct's main floor was a symphony of murmurs and tension, papers shuffled too quickly, glances darted too often, and conversations trailed off the moment Chief Camille Price stepped in. She moved through the room like a tide, calm, certain, unstoppable. Not a word passed her lips at first, but the silence that followed her presence was louder than any reprimand. Officers turned in their chairs. Some straightened their posture. Others lowered their eyes, not out of guilt, but uncertainty. They all knew what this moment was. She reached the center of the room and turned slowly to face the gathering. Every voice disappeared. Every motion stilled. Then, with quiet force, she spoke. Let me be clear, Camille said, her tone low, precise, every syllable cutting through the tension like light through fog. Accountability applies to everyone. The words echoed not just in the room, but in the bones of those who heard it. Not shouted, not forced, delivered with the calm of someone who knew the truth, who carried it like armor. This badge, she continued, her fingers brushing the one pinned over her heart, does not grant immunity. It grants responsibility. And if anyone in this department believes they are beyond that, they are in the wrong building. At the back of the room, Kyle Easton stood with his arms crossed, jaw clenched, trying to project defiance, but his silence betrayed him. He had heard the same message as everyone else. Only to him it felt personal, because it was. Camille held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a short nod. That's all. She walked away without fanfare, without a single backward glance. But the tremor in the room lingered long after her footsteps faded. As the officers returned to their desks, the air was different, charged, uncertain. Not everyone agreed with her. But everyone understood one thing. The rules had changed. The silence that once shielded misconduct had been broken. Later in the hallway, Philip Kane caught up to Kyle. His voice was quiet, wary. She's not backing down, man. Man. Kyle didn't reply at first. He stared at the closed door of the chief's office like it was something living, breathing, and watching him back. She wants to humiliate me, he muttered. And I'm not going to let her win. Philip said nothing. Because in his gut, he knew Camille Price hadn't come to humiliate anyone. She had come to wake the entire department. And that morning she had done just that. The hearing room pulsed with a quiet, charged intensity. Every breath, every movement, every whispered word felt tethered to something larger than protocol. It was a confrontation between the old shadows of the department and the light trying to break through. At one end of the long mahogany table sat Chief Camille Price, composed, unflinching, dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb every flicker of tension around her. Across from her sat Kyle Easton, flanked by his union representative, face unreadable but shoulders tight with restrained rage. Around them, board members and advisors lined the seats, expressions veiled behind official neutrality. The proceedings began with procedural formalities, but when Camille spoke, the entire room leaned in. Her voice didn't waver, her tone didn't rise, but each word landed with the weight of conviction sharpened by truth. She played the footage, no commentary needed. It spoke for itself, the aggression, the refusal to listen, the shove, the arrogance, crystal clear. Indisputable. Then came the internal reports. Pages of procedural violations. And finally, testimonies from fellow officers who had witnessed similar conduct in the past, accounts that had once been whispered but now stood tall in the light. Camille stood, holding nothing back. Her words were not just a defense of her authority but a vision. This isn't about me, she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. And it isn't about Officer Easton. It's about what kind of department we want to be. One that protects ego, or one that protects people. One that preserves silence, or one that champions truth. Her voice cut through the room like a bell in fog. Because if we allow behavior like this to go unchecked, we send a message that rank matters more than respect, that tradition matters more than transformation. And that will not be the legacy I leave behind. A long silence followed. No applause. No objections. Just stillness. Because deep down, every person in that room knew she was right. In the days that followed, the ripples spread. Some resisted. Some relented. But a shift had begun, however fragile, however faint. And Camille, though weary, pressed forward, initiating policy reforms, expanding bias training, and advocating for an independent oversight board. It was not glamorous work. It was not easy. But it was necessary. And one evening, standing in her office alone, she gazed out over the city as dusk settled over the skyline. The hum of traffic below, the golden haze over the rooftops, it all felt different. Not because the fight was over, but because something sacred had begun. Change. Not in declarations or headlines, but in the quiet defiance of a woman who refused to sit down, who refused to shut up, and who dared to believe that integrity still had a place in power. The battle would continue. The road would be long. But for the first time in a long time, Camille Price knew she wasn't walking it alone. 3 weeks after the hearing, the station had settled, but only on the surface. Conversation still paused when Chief Camille Price walked into a room. Some eyes followed her with newfound respect, others with resentment still brewing beneath polite nods. But none could deny one truth. The old ways had been cracked open. A bulletin board near the entrance now held a revised mission statement, freshly printed and pinned in bold type. Respect is not optional. Accountability is not negotiable. Camille hadn't written it. One of the younger officers had, but she left it there because it meant someone had been listening. In the locker room, whispers about her making waves had shifted to quiet reflection. Officers who once shrugged off misconduct now double-checked their body cams before each shift. A few still clung to the past, but others? They had started to wonder what a future with real integrity might look like. Outside the precinct, something subtler was unfolding. At a local high school, a civics teacher referenced Camille's story as a case study on leadership and moral courage. A teenage girl asked, "Can one woman really change an entire department?" The teacher paused, then replied, "She already has." And she didn't need a headline, just a backbone. Camille herself remained measured. She declined interviews. She stayed off the front page. But in staff meetings, in hallway encounters, and in silent moments of eye contact, something was different. People were watching her not with suspicion, but with the uneasy hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be better. That Friday evening, Camille lingered outside her office longer than usual. She glanced at the hallway bulletin board. Beneath the mission statement, someone had scribbled in marker, "Better isn't easy, but it's worth it." But worth it. She didn't smile, but she stayed there for a long time, reading it again and again. Because sometimes change doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers 3 weeks later and still growing. A full month had passed, and yet the ripple of that one moment in the parking lot still pulsed beneath every conversation inside the precinct. Some tried to pretend it was over, filed away with the internal review. But others knew better. The culture had shifted, and silence no longer shielded the comfortable. Chief Camille Price had become more than a figure of authority. She was now a symbol of a new standard. Officers who once dismissed the idea of reform now sat through bias training without smirks, taking notes not because they had to, but because something had changed. Across the city, the story had spread. Community groups that once held the department at arm's length began reaching out, not with anger, but with cautious collaboration. A local pastor invited Camille to speak at a town hall. She declined the podium but showed up anyway, sitting in the back row, just to listen. And in one of the quietest, most unexpected gestures, a veteran officer with 27 years on the force, known for never speaking out, slipped a handwritten note onto her desk before leaving for patrol. It read, "I was wrong. You belong here more than anyone. Thank you for not backing down." Camille read it once, folded it, and placed it in the drawer beneath her badge. Not because she needed validation, but because reminders like that mattered in a fight that never ends in one day. At headquarters, an old plaque was quietly removed from the front hallway. In its place, a new one appeared. The quote on it was short but sharp. "Respect must be practiced, not presumed." Camille passed it on her way out that evening. She paused only for a moment, then kept walking, coat over her arm, eyes steady. 1 month later, she wasn't waiting for change to arrive. She was already building it with every step, every breath, and every unshakable standard she refused to lower. 6 months had passed, and what once felt like a tremor had grown into something deeper, a shift not just in policy, but in mindset. The precinct was quieter now, not with silence, but with focus. New recruits walked the halls with a different posture, not hardened by cynicism, but sharpened by purpose. Officers spoke more carefully, not out of fear, but out of a growing sense of responsibility. The jokes had changed. The tone had changed. Even the coffee room chatter carried an edge of awareness. Chief Camille Price no longer needed to raise her voice to be heard. Her presence alone now stood for something unspoken, yet undeniable. Accountability had found its footing. Across the city, schools taught her name in classrooms not as a hero, but as an example. Community boards displayed flyers titled "Meet the Department," hosting monthly forums where citizens sat face to face with officers, not to protest but to talk. And yet Camille knew the real progress couldn't be measured in headlines or training hours logged. It lived in the quiet moments. Like when a rookie officer barely a month on the job knocked on her office door one evening just to say, "I joined because of what you did. I didn't think someone like you could lead here, but now I do." Or when she passed the bulletin board and saw that the mission statement, the same one printed months ago, was no longer just taped up. It was laminated, protected, treated like it belonged. The city wasn't perfect. The department still had cracks, but change had taken root and it was no longer fragile. That night, Camille stood by her window looking out at the streetlights flickering against the dark. Somewhere out there, someone was being treated fairly because of a standard she refused to compromise. She didn't need to see it to believe it. Because 6 months later, justice wasn't just spoken. It had become a habit, a culture, a quiet, resilient kind of power that no arrogance could erase. This story makes us wonder, in places where justice is supposed to be upheld, how many are still treated like enemies simply because they're different. Through everything that happened, we've learned that courage doesn't always come with a shout sometimes. It's calm in the face of chaos. I believe true change doesn't begin in grand meetings, but in the quiet moment when one person says, "I won't stay silent anymore." And what about you? After hearing this story, what do you think is the most important truth to hold on to? What will you do differently starting today? Because sometimes that single question and how each of us chooses to answer it is the biggest change of all. Note: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.